Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a warm, quiet stretch of ocean in the early 18th century. So if you're listening in bed, go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights. This is a pirate story, technically, but not the exciting kind. There will be no swinging on ropes, no cannon fire, and no heroic last stands. Instead, we'll spend our time with a small pirate ship that found itself trapped by something far more powerful than any navy: the complete absence of wind. And because, of course it did, the ship itself was unremarkable. A modest sloop, lightly armed, slightly leaky, and perpetually in need of repairs. She had a name, as all ships did, though most of the crew disagreed on what it was. Some called her the Providence, others the Persistent Trouble, and one sailor insisted she was named after a woman who had already forgotten him. In official pirate records, which were not known for their precision, she was listed simply as the sloop. She floated somewhere in the Caribbean, where the water was blue, the sun was relentless, and the horizon never changed. No wind filled her sails, not even a polite breeze. The sea lay flat and glossy, like it had given up entirely. On board were about 30 men, all of whom had expected piracy to be a faster career path. Their captain was a man named Captain Crowe, though that may or may not have been his real name. Pirate captains often chose names that sounded dramatic, which usually meant something involving birds, storms, or vaguely biblical doom. Crowe was in his late 30s, already tired and deeply annoyed by circumstances beyond his control, which, as it turned out, described most of his life. Crowe had not grown up dreaming of piracy. He'd grown up dreaming of not starving. This was a common aspiration. He'd worked on merchant ships, navy ships, and ships that claimed to be legitimate but clearly were not. By the time he became a pirate captain, it felt less like rebellion and more like paperwork with worse hours. Now, as his ship sat motionless, he stood at the rail each morning, squinting at the sky as if staring hard enough might convince the wind to return. Naturally, it did not. Days passed, then more days. The sun rose, the sun set. The ship did not move. The crew settled into routines born entirely out of boredom. Decks were scrubbed until they were clean enough to disappoint everyone involved. Sails were checked, rechecked, and discussed at length. Knots were retied, then untied, then tied again, slightly differently, just to feel productive. One sailor, a man named Thomas Reed, began counting clouds, not for navigation, just counting them. Another sailor attempted to teach a rat to follow commands. The rat declined. Food became an ongoing topic of conversation. Not eating it, discussing it. Salt beef was inspected, sniffed, and complained about. Hardtack was tapped against the rail to knock the bugs out, which was considered an acceptable improvement. Water barrels were opened, closed, and opened again as if something might have changed. The lack of wind made everything quieter. No flapping sails, no rushing water along the hull. Just the slow creak of wood expanding in the heat. At night, the ocean lapped gently against a ship, a sound so consistent it became almost hypnotic. Somewhere around the 5th day, the crew stopped asking when they'd move again. They began asking what day it was. No one was entirely sure. Captain Crowe attempted to maintain authority, which is difficult when nothing is happening. One man claimed he had once seen a royal governor faint at the sight of a pirate flag. Another claimed the same governor had tripped over his own dignity. Both versions were equally unverifiable. As the ship drifted, or rather failed to drift, the heat became heavier. Clothes were worn loosely, tempers were worn thin. Even arguments lacked energy. They began slowly, petered out, and ended with everyone lying down again. Piracy, it turned out, involved a lot of waiting. This was not mentioned in the recruitment speeches. Captain Crowe kept a journal, which was unusual and deeply unnecessary. In it, he recorded the lack of wind in increasingly irritated handwriting. "Still calm," he wrote one day. The next day, unbearably calm. A few days later, simply mockingly calm. He also worried about supplies. They weren't in immediate danger, but pirates were rarely comfortable with margins. Every biscuit eaten was a biscuit that could not be eaten later. Every cup of water was a future complaint. At night, the crew slept on deck when they could. The air below was stifling. Stars spread across the sky, bright and indifferent. Someone usually snored. Someone else complained about the snoring. No one did anything about it. There was talk, eventually, of rowing. This suggestion was met with long silence. Rowing a ship of that size in open water under a blazing sun for an unknown distance did not inspire enthusiasm. The oars stayed where they were. On the 10th or 11th day, time had become flexible. Someone spotted a distant sail. Excitement flickered briefly. Spyglasses were raised. Plans were half-formed. Then the sail disappeared behind the curvature of the earth, carried away by a wind that still refused to visit them. Naturally, this made things worse. One sailor suggested praying. Another suggested swearing louder. Both approaches were attempted. Neither worked. Crowe paced the deck, rehearsing speeches he might give once they were moving again. Threats, inspirations, promises of future success. All of them felt hollow while the ship sat perfectly still. The sea around them remained deceptively calm. Fish moved lazily beneath the surface. Occasionally, a bird passed overhead, clearly unimpressed. This was piracy stripped of romance. No danger, no glory, just men, a ship, and the slow realization that the world did not care about their schedule. Eventually, because things do eventually happen, even in boring history, a breeze began to stir. It was barely noticeable at first, a slight movement of air, a whisper. Sails twitched. Someone pointed. Someone else refused to get excited too quickly. The wind strengthened, slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether it truly wanted to be involved. Sails filled, the ship creaked in a new way, and then, almost imperceptibly, she began to move. There was no cheering, just relief. Quiet, exhausted relief. Captain Crowe closed his journal for the day. He did not write about triumph. He wrote, "Finally." And as the ship slipped forward across the water, the crew returned to their stations with the subdued competence of men who had learned a valuable lesson. Piracy was not constant adventure. Sometimes it was just waiting for the wind. And so the ship moved again, not quickly, not confidently, just enough to remind everyone that progress, like most things in history, often arrives without enthusiasm. The breeze that finally found them was mild, almost apologetic. It filled the sails in a half-hearted way, as if the wind itself had other appointments. The sloop slid forward across the water with the dignity of something that had been embarrassed recently and preferred not to talk about it. Captain Crowe stood at the stern, hands clasped behind his back, watching the wake form again. It was a thin wake, but it was a wake, and at this point, that felt like a luxury. The crew returned to motion with surprising calm. No celebration, no speeches, just quiet adjustments. Ropes were checked, sails trimmed, someone coughed, someone else scratched a sunburn that had already been scratched too many times. After days of stillness, movement felt strange. A few sailors reported mild dizziness, as if their bodies had forgotten what forward motion was supposed to feel like. One man sat down abruptly and decided not to stand again for a while. The sea, still flat and bright, slid past the hull in slow ribbons of blue. Flying fish occasionally burst from the water, glided briefly, and vanished again. No one commented. They had seen too many strange things recently to be impressed with fish with ambition. Crowe ordered a modest course adjustment. Nothing dramatic, no sudden dash toward a rich trade route, just a slow, careful turn toward waters where ships were rumored to exist. Rumors, of course, being the backbone of pirate navigation. As the hours passed, the crew settled back into routines that now felt almost comforting. Boredom, when familiar, becomes a kind of friend. Decks were scrubbed again, not because they needed it, but because clean decks gave the illusion of control. Someone repaired a tear in a sail that did not strictly need repairing. Another man polished a cannon that had not been fired in months and probably would not be fired anytime soon. The heat remained relentless. Shirts stayed loose or absent entirely. Skin darkened. Time stretched. Pirate ships, contrary to popular belief, spent far more time avoiding effort than seeking danger. The idea of leaping into battle was appealing in theory, but exhausting in practice. Most captains preferred easy targets, cooperative victims, and outcomes that did not require running. Captain Crowe was no exception. He had built his reputation not on daring, but on persistence. He waited longer than other pirates. He chased less. He accepted modest success and lived to complain about it later.
The crew prepared anyway. Weapons were checked. Faces hardened slightly, not with excitement, but with obligation. When they finally drew near, the merchant captain did something deeply inconvenient. He surrendered immediately. No chase, no resistance, just a white cloth raised in quiet resignation. Boarding was quick and anticlimactic. The cargo was inspected. Some sugar, some cloth, nothing worth fighting over. Crowe negotiated briefly. His tone was polite, almost bored. Terms were agreed upon. A portion of the cargo was transferred. Receipts of a sort were exchanged, because pirates were nothing if not oddly procedural. Within an hour, it was over. The merchant ship sailed on, lighter but intact. The pirates returned to their deck with supplies and no injuries. There was no celebration, just a collective sense that the effort had been adequate. That night, dinner included slightly better food. Conversation improved marginally. Someone laughed, briefly, then stopped. The wind remained steady but unenthusiastic. The sea continued its endless indifference. Crowe wrote in his journal again. Encountered ship, he noted. Outcome acceptable. This was as close as he came to praise. As days blurred together, the crew found themselves once more in the long middle stretch of a voyage. Not desperate, not prosperous, just afloat. Small irritations returned. Arguments over sleeping space. Complaints about snoring. A near fight over a misplaced cup that turned out to be exactly where it had always been. Pirate democracy, much admired in theory, often resulted in lengthy discussions about trivial matters. Votes were held, grievances aired. Nothing changed. Crowe allowed it. A crew that argued was at least awake. On another quiet morning, the ship passed through a field of floating seaweed. The water turned darker. Movement slowed again. For a brief moment, memories of stillness returned. But this time, the wind held. The sloop pushed through, steady and patient, as if it had learned something during those long, unmoving days. or perhaps the crew had. As the sun climbed higher, the deck warmed. Someone hummed absent-mindedly. Another man leaned against the rail and closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of motion lull him. Piracy, in the end, was less about rebellion and more about endurance, about surviving boredom, discomfort, and the quiet realization that freedom came with its own routines. And as the ship carried on, cutting gently through the water, the days folded into one another. Not memorable, not dramatic, just another stretch of time drifting by. Let's stay with them a little longer. Let the horizon remain distant and allow the story to continue at its natural, unhurried pace. The days that followed blended together so smoothly that even the calendar, had there been one worth trusting, would have struggled to keep up. Morning arrived, then afternoon, then evening, each one polite, predictable, and entirely unconcerned with pirate ambition. The ship continued forward at a respectable, forgettable pace, not fast enough to feel victorious, not slow enough to cause panic, just enough motion to remind everyone that they were technically going somewhere. Captain Crowe grew quieter during this stretch, not withdrawn, just economical with his words. He spent long periods staring at the water, as if the sea might eventually confess its plans. It did not. The crew adapted, as crews always do. They developed a rhythm so ingrained it barely required thought. Wake, eat, work, wait, sleep, repeat. Pirate life, stripped of its myths, was mostly maintenance. Wood needed care, rope needed checking, sails needed watching, because sails had a habit of tearing at the worst possible moment, usually when no one felt like fixing them.
The crew prepared anyway. Weapons were checked. Faces hardened slightly, not with excitement, but with obligation. When they finally drew near, the merchant captain did something deeply inconvenient. He surrendered immediately. No chase, no resistance, just a white cloth raised in quiet resignation. Boarding was quick and anticlimactic. The cargo was inspected. Some sugar, some cloth, nothing worth fighting over. Crowe negotiated briefly. His tone was polite, almost bored. Terms were agreed upon. A portion of the cargo was transferred. Receipts of a sort were exchanged, because pirates were nothing if not oddly procedural. Within an hour, it was over. The merchant ship sailed on, lighter but intact. The pirates returned to their deck with supplies and no injuries. There was no celebration, just a collective sense that the effort had been adequate. That night, dinner included slightly better food. Conversation improved marginally. Someone laughed briefly, then stopped. The wind remained steady but unenthusiastic. The sea continued its endless indifference. Crowe wrote in his journal again. Encountered ship, he noted. Outcome acceptable. This was as close as he came to praise. As days blurred together, the crew found themselves once more in the long middle stretch of a voyage. Not desperate, not prosperous, just afloat. Small irritations returned. Arguments over sleeping space, complaints about snoring, a near fight over a misplaced cup that turned out to be exactly where it had always been. Pirate democracy, much admired in theory, often resulted in lengthy discussions about trivial matters. Votes were held, grievances aired. Nothing changed. Crowe allowed it. A crew that argued was at least awake. On another quiet morning, the ship passed through a field of floating seaweed. The water turned darker. Movement slowed again. For a brief moment, memories of stillness returned.
But this time, the wind held. The sloop pushed through, steady and patient, as if it had learned something during those long, unmoving days. Or perhaps the crew had. As the sun climbed higher, the deck warmed. Someone hummed absent-mindedly. Another man leaned against the rail and closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of motion lull him. Piracy, in the end, was less about rebellion and more about endurance, about surviving boredom, discomfort, and the quiet realization that freedom came with its own routines. And as the ship carried on, cutting gently through the water, the days folded into one another. Not memorable, not dramatic, just another stretch of time drifting by. Let's stay with them a little longer. Let the horizon remain distant, and allow the story to continue at its natural, unhurried pace. The days that followed blended together so smoothly that even the calendar, had there been one worth trusting, would have struggled to keep up. Morning arrived, then afternoon, then evening, each one polite, predictable, and entirely unconcerned with pirate ambition. The ship continued forward at a respectable, forgettable pace. Not fast enough to feel victorious, not slow enough to cause panic. Just enough motion to remind everyone that they were technically going somewhere. Captain Crowe grew quieter during this stretch. Not withdrawn, just economical with his words. He spent long periods staring at the water, as if the sea might eventually confess its plans. It did not. The crew adapted, as crews always do. They developed a rhythm so ingrained it barely required thought. Wake, eat, work, wait, sleep, repeat. Pirate life, stripped of its myths, was mostly maintenance. Wood needed care. Rope needed checking. Sails needed watching, because sails had a habit of tearing at the worst possible moment, usually when no one felt like fixing them.
One afternoon, a plank near the bow was discovered to be soft. This discovery led to a lengthy discussion. Was it dangerous? Possibly. Was it urgent? Debatable. Was it someone else's responsibility? Absolutely. Eventually, it was repaired with minimal enthusiasm and maximum commentary. Crowe oversaw this process with the tired patience of a man who had learned that urgency was a resource best conserved. Panic was expensive. Calm, even feigned calm, lasted longer. At night, the ship creaked gently as it cut through the water. Lanterns swayed. Shadows stretched and shrank with the motion. The stars overhead remained unchanged, distant markers of a universe that had no interest in pirate schedules. Sleep came easily to most of the crew now. Movement was comforting. The gentle roll of the ship smoothed away the restlessness that had plagued them during those windless days. Men fell asleep mid-thought, mid-sentence occasionally. Dreams, when remembered, were strange but muted. Endless docks, ships that never arrived, wind that always seemed to come from the wrong direction. One sailor, a quiet man named William Pike, began talking in his sleep. Nothing alarming, just murmured complaints about missing boots, unfinished meals, and someone, no one could tell who, standing in the wrong place. No one bothered to wake him. It felt rude. Food supplies settled into a new normal. Not plentiful, not dire, just adequate. Meals were eaten slowly, not because they were enjoyed, but because there was no reason to rush. Hardtack softened slightly when dipped in water, which was considered an innovation. Salt meat remained salt meat. No amount of optimism improved it. Occasionally, a flying fish landed on deck. This caused brief confusion, then dinner. Crowe allowed these small mercies without comment. A captain who complained too much invited complaints in return. As the days passed, the crew grew less talkative, not out of tension, out of contentment. There is a particular quiet that settles when nothing is urgently wrong. Pirates, despite their reputation, were deeply practical people. They knew better than most that danger announced itself loudly. This silence, then, was a gift. On one uneventful morning, the lookout spotted land. Just a hint of it, a darker line against the horizon. This news spread slowly. No shouts, no sudden movement, just a quiet adjustment of attention. Land meant choices. Choices meant effort. Crowe studied the distant shape for a long time. He weighed possibilities. Was it inhabited, defended, worth the trouble? He had learned over the years that many islands promised opportunity and delivered inconvenience. Fresh water was good. People were complicated. As they drew closer, the island revealed itself to be small, green, and deeply unassuming. No obvious fortifications, no welcoming harbor either, just a stretch of beach and thick vegetation beyond. Crowe ordered the ship to anchor offshore. No need to commit too early. A small boat was lowered. A few men volunteered to go ashore. Volunteered in this context meant they were less tired than the others. The landing was uneventful. Sand, heat, insects, all familiar. The shore party returned with news that matched expectations. Some fresh water, some fruit, no people, no obvious threats. Also, an alarming number of mosquitoes. Crowe nodded. Supplies were gathered carefully. Not too much, just enough to make the effort worthwhile. The ship remained anchored for 2 quiet days. The crew enjoyed the rare novelty of standing on land without being chased. They stretched legs grown accustomed to the deck. They complained about the heat in a slightly different way. No one wandered far. Experience had taught them that curiosity was expensive. At night, the ship rested at anchor, barely moving. The stillness felt different now, not oppressive, just calm. Someone remarked that the silence reminded him of home. No one asked what home had been like. On the 3rd morning, Crowe ordered them underway again. Lingering was a habit he discouraged. Pirates who lingered tended to attract attention. The sails were raised, the anchor hauled up with practiced motions. The ship slipped back into open water. As the island shrank behind them, the crew returned to their places without ceremony. Another location passed, another memory added to the collection of places that did not matter much. The sea welcomed them back with its usual indifference. Time resumed its gentle blur. Crowe found himself thinking, not for the first time, about the future. Not in grand terms, just practical ones. Supplies, crew morale, his own growing weariness. Pirate captains aged quickly, not in years, in patience. He wondered how long he would continue, how many more voyages, how many more windless days. The answers did not present themselves. Instead, there was only the next sunrise, the next meal, the next stretch of water. And so the ship sailed on, not toward glory, not toward disaster, just forward. The crew settled into the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling, a shared understanding that nothing remarkable was required of them at the moment. Let's stay right here with them, in this long, unremarkable middle, where history so often spends its time. The sea remained cooperative in the way that feels temporary, not generous, just neutral. The wind held steady enough to be useful,
which was more than anyone expected at this point. The ship moved on through days that resisted description, not because they were secret or complex, but because they were made of the same small pieces rearranged slightly each time. Morning began with light creeping over the deck. Someone always woke before everyone else, though no one knew why. He would sit up, blink at the horizon, and immediately regret being awake. Gradually, the rest followed. Breakfast was quiet. Chewing took effort. Conversation did not. Captain Crowe rose early, but never dramatically. No grand strides, no sweeping glances. He appeared, nodded to no one in particular, and took his place as if he had always been there. Authority, in his case, was mostly a matter of endurance. He checked the compass. He checked the sails. He checked the sky. All three behaved as expected, which was both reassuring and faintly disappointing. The crew worked with the efficiency of men who knew exactly how much effort was required and refused to give more. Ropes were handled gently, knots tied securely but without flourish. For now, the ship continued forward. The wind held, the sea remained indifferent, and history, as it so often does, lingered in this unremarkable stretch, not rushing ahead, not looking back. Let's remain here a little longer, in this gentle drift, where nothing demands our attention, and the story keeps breathing at its own slow pace. The land ahead grew clearer by degrees, not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough detail added each hour to confirm that it was real and not another trick of the light. It was a small port, not the kind sung about. No towering fort, no proud flags snapping in the wind. Just a low sprawl of buildings pressed against the shoreline, as if they had settled there accidentally and never quite committed. Captain Crowe watched it emerge with mild interest. Ports like this were useful. They asked fewer questions, they expected less honesty, and they rarely remembered names. The ship approached at a measured pace, sails adjusted, lines prepared, everything done with the subdued efficiency of men who had docked many times and been impressed exactly none of them. As they drew closer, details sharpened. Wooden piers, a handful of small boats tied haphazardly, people moving slowly as if the heat had negotiated a permanent truce with effort. No one on shore appeared alarmed. This was encouraging. A port that panicked easily was usually expensive. Crowe ordered the colors kept modest. No need to announce intentions too loudly. Pirate flags were effective, but subtlety had its advantages. They docked without incident. The hull nudged the pier. Lines were thrown, knots secured. And just like that, they were somewhere new, or at least somewhere different enough to justify the trip. The crew disembarked in small groups, not out of strategy, out of habit. Large groups attracted attention. Small groups blended into the general disinterest. The port smelled like salt, old wood, and neglect, which was familiar. Crowe took a slow walk along the dock, observing without comment. He noted the absence of soldiers, the lack of order, the presence of taverns. This would do. Supplies were their first concern. Fresh water, food that had not been preserved beyond recognition, maybe new rope if the price did not inspire resentment. Transactions were conducted quietly. Coins exchanged hands. No one asked where the ship had come from. No one asked where it was going. This mutual lack of curiosity was deeply appreciated. The crew spread out, careful not to look like a crew. Some visited taverns, others wandered the market. A few simply sat in the shade and did nothing at all.
Crowe chose a tavern with low ceilings and indifferent furniture. Inside, the air was thick and unmoving. He ordered a drink that tasted vaguely fermented and accepted it without complaint. The tavern keeper glanced at him once, then returned to wiping a counter that did not improve with attention. They shared a moment of silent understanding. Neither expected much from the day. Crowe listened to the room. Murmured conversations, complaints about prices, rumors that contradicted one another enthusiastically. Nothing useful, which was, in its own way, reassuring. One of Crowe's men joined him briefly, reported that supplies were being loaded, then left again. Efficiency was a virtue best displayed quietly. Outside, the port continued its slow existence. People moved from one task to another without urgency. A cart creaked by. A dog slept in the shade, unconcerned with piracy or economics. By late afternoon, the crew reconvened near the ship. Supplies had been acquired, no one was missing, no fights had occurred. This was considered a success. Crowe oversaw the loading with mild attention. He corrected nothing. Everything looked adequate. As the sun lowered, the ship prepared to depart. There was no reason to stay overnight. Ports remembered ships better after dark. They cast off quietly. The pier receded. The port returned to whatever it had been doing before they arrived. No farewell, no acknowledgement. The ship slipped back into open water, carrying slightly fuller barrels and the same number of questions as before. As the coastline faded, the crew settled once more into familiar positions. The routine resumed almost immediately, as if the visit had been a brief interruption rather than a change. That night, the sea was calm again. Not still, just calm enough to encourage reflection. Crowe stood alone at the stern, watching the faint lights of the port disappear entirely. He felt no attachment, just a quiet satisfaction that the stop had been uncomplicated. Uncomplicated stops were the best kind. He thought briefly about how little mark they left behind. A few coins exchanged, a few barrels moved, then nothing. History, after all, rarely noticed the people who passed through quietly. The crew slept well that night. Bellies slightly fuller, concerns slightly postponed. The wind remained steady. The ship moved on. And with the port behind them, the journey returned to its natural state. Water, sky, time unfolding without comment.